What's a story where you had a terrible gut feeling about a person or situation, and it turned out to be exactly right? My dad was a drug addict throughout my life. Being the oldest child, I never hesitated to call him out, asking where he was, why he was working late, and so on. This past May, he had relapsed yet again, and I refused to speak to him. I went to visit my boyfriend's family out of state and hadn't spoken to my dad for probably 2 weeks. That Saturday night, while I was in another state, away from my dad and the rest of my family, I suddenly sat straight up in bed from a dead sleep, and the first thought in my mind was that my dad was gone. I woke my boyfriend and told him, but he said it was probably just a bad dream and told me to go back to sleep. The next morning, I was still overwhelmed by an inexplicable sense of dread. I told my boyfriend that I wanted to go home early, and he agreed. By then, I had already tried reaching my dad multiple times by phone, but with no success, which was common when he relapsed. Not even 45 minutes into our 4-hour drive, I got a call from my mom, who was also unable to reach my dad. She was panicking since he was out of town for a job in another city. I kept trying to get in touch with him. Finally, my mom called the police to do a welfare check on my dad at the hotel where he was staying, and I was right. He had passed away from a heart attack the night before. The same night I woke up from a dead sleep with the overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. That feeling still haunts me to this day, and I feel guilt for not speaking to him 2 weeks before he passed away. I am now in grief counseling, recounting my life story to try and work through the emotions of growing up with a parent struggling with addiction. About 7 years ago, my great-aunt's husband passed away. While she was still grieving, she met this guy and eventually married him. No one in my family liked him, and we all got bad vibes from him. Fast forward to October of last year. One day, while she was at work, he packed all his things, left a note on the table that read, "I'm not happy. Goodbye," and left. Later, we found out through an acquaintance that this was the 4th widowed woman he'd done this to. He marries them for a free ride for a while and then jumps ship when he gets bored or whatever. A real shit bag of a human. During college, I studied abroad and was in Dubrovnik, Croatia. We were told it was safe to walk around alone, after being in a few not-so-safe places. So one day, I went out with my earphones in, just walking around town and taking in the sights. I found a stairway that led down the side of a cliff to the ocean and decided to explore. I got towards the bottom and saw a sign on the ground that said, "Private." I noticed people fishing further down the steps, so I figured I'd just stop and sit on a large rock to do some journaling. This is where things got creepy. As I sat there, people passed by occasionally, and I didn't notice anything unusual. Then, this one guy came down, and I immediately felt off about him. He walked down the next set of steps and out of view, but about 5 minutes later, he came back up and sat at the top of the stairs, looking out at the ocean. I was uneasy, so I kept an eye on him. Minutes turned into 10, then 20, then 30, and the guy didn't move, except to occasionally glance back at me. I started mentally planning my options, how fast I could get up the stairs, how loud I could scream, where I could go at the top, or if there was a store nearby. Eventually, it had been about 45 minutes, the sun was starting to go down, and no one had passed by. I knew there were still people down below, and I even took a picture of the guy as subtly as I could, just in case something happened. Finally, I packed up my stuff, and the second I started moving, he perked up and began watching me more closely. I panicked, feeling sure he was going to try something. I kept thinking, if someone walks by, I'll run. If no one does, I'll still run. Finally, a woman and her young son came up from the fishing area, and I let them reach the top of the first flight of stairs before I bolted. As soon as I stood up, the guy got up and started following me. I've never run so fast in my life. I passed the woman and her son, racing up the second set of steps and down the street, looking for somewhere to hide or a store to duck into. The man was still behind me, but fortunately, he was not in great shape. I managed to get about half a block when I ran into a professor and his wife. I begged them to walk with me. I was in a full panic. At that point, I saw the guy again, this time on a motorcycle, slowly driving down the street, clearly looking for me. The professor and his wife walked me back to the ship and through security, just to make sure he wouldn't try anything. He followed us the entire way back, doing slow loops on his motorcycle, passing by repeatedly. It was terrifying. I used to work as a fire lookout, think fire watch, and spent my summers mostly alone. I would hike and fish a lot, and one evening after my shift, I went down to a nearby creek. I was sitting on the bank with my line in the water when I suddenly had this overwhelming feeling that I wanted to be anywhere but there. It was really unsettling because I was completely alone, probably the only person for miles. So, I packed up and moved downstream. After walking about 100 yards, I looked back and saw a huge bear right where I had been sitting, sniffing the air. I quietly put down all the food I had on me, an apple and a sandwich for dinner, and moved further down until I reached a logging road, then headed back to my lookout. I can't be certain, but I felt like the bear had caught my scent and that his hunger might have outweighed any fear of a human. I hope he enjoyed my sandwich. It was the last of my turkey until resupply a few weeks later. Back in college, when I was a lifeguard, I had a gut feeling that ended up saving a man's life. The pool where I worked had 3 guard chairs and 1 guard at the top of the slide. I was stationed at the top of the slide when it happened. Usually, the guard up there just sits in a chair, not paying attention unless there's a line of kids waiting. But that day was slow, and I liked to stand up there and people watch. I noticed a man come in and walk toward the benches near the slide. For whatever reason, as soon as he walked in, I had a strong feeling something was off about him. He was about 150 feet away, but I locked onto him and watched as he walked to the benches. The moment he sat down, I shut down the slide, raced down the stairs, sprinted to the other pool room where the automated external defibrillator, AED, and my manager were, grabbed the AED, and told my manager to call emergency medical services immediately. Then I dashed back to the other pool room. As soon as I opened the door separating the 2 pool rooms, the man slumped over and fell off the bench. We checked his airway, breathing, and circulation, attached the AED pads to his chest, and started CPR. The paramedics arrived after a couple of cycles, about 5 minutes. Their station was only 2 blocks away, and took over. I found out a few days later that the man had a heart attack, but he survived and had to undergo emergency open heart surgery. I still don't know what I saw that told me something was wrong, but I'll always remember that eerie feeling when all the hair on my body seemed to stand on end. Not me, but my mom. This is the story she told me as a follow your gut lesson. When she was in undergrad, this would have been in the late 70s or early 80s, she had a professor that everyone loved. He was hilarious, a great teacher, and very friendly. But my mom couldn't stand him. She described it as feeling like he was pretending to be someone else, or like someone else was pulling the strings on a puppet. She even mentioned this to her friends, but, as I said, everyone else loved him. Fast forward about 10 years. My mom was out of undergrad, had finished her master's, and was living in New York. One day, she was watching the news, and who does she see but that same professor? It turned out he was a serial rapist. The way she tells it, she started jumping up and down in her apartment, just saying, "I knew it, I knew it." This might not exactly fit the criteria, but I thought I'd share anyway. One night, I had a really weird, vivid dream where I was in a room with a closed coffin in the center that had a crucifix on it. The room's decor struck me as odd, as it was half brick and half wood paneling. Also, no one I'm close to is religious at all, so when I woke up, it stuck with me, leaving me unsettled and with a bad feeling. Fast forward 2 months later, and I'm standing in the exact room from my dream, down to the positioning of the coffin. My stepdad had been unexpectedly killed at work, and, at the request of his non-practicing religious mother, my mom compromised on some funeral arrangements and placed a crucifix on the lid of his coffin. One night in middle school, in the middle of a school week, I begged my mom to take me to my grandma's for the night. I usually spent weekends with them, and they lived about 20 minutes away, far enough to make it a hassle to drive there after dinner and a long workday. But they came and picked me up. That night, an electrical fire started in the outlet by my bed and burned our house down. The firefighters said I wouldn't have survived if I'd been in my bed sleeping. Our Labrador woke my mom up and saved her, and somehow, my cat and her 7 kittens all escaped from my room, even with the door closed. It still freaks me out to think about. I met my, now ex-wife's new boss. He looked perfectly normal, a younger guy, not bad looking. But something about the way he shook my hand and smiled at me felt off. I'm usually very friendly and probably a bit too trusting, but this guy just left me with all kinds of uneasy feelings. It turned out he used his position of power to manipulate multiple women, at least 7 that we knew of, into inappropriate situations. This was at a large, well-known store. When upper management heard about it, every woman in the store was interviewed, and he was marched out by security. I knew from the moment I met him that he was going to be a very big problem. No idea how. My brother and his fiancée were good friends with our neighbor down the street, but something about this guy felt off. He was creepy to me. I was 21 at the time. Whenever he'd leave, I'd mention to them that something about, let's call him, Dave felt wrong, but they'd just say he was a nice guy and that I was overreacting. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Then, one day, one of our neighbors discreetly put an envelope in our mailbox that read, "If you value your children's safety, open immediately." We opened the letter to find a picture of him along with a police report. This individual was someone with harmful inclinations toward minors who had hurt his own daughter. I just screamed, "I told you. I haven't seen him around in a while, and I say good riddance. From now on, if my gut gives me a feeling like that, I'll investigate that person." When I was about 9, my little brother and I were riding our bikes up and down our street. He was a couple of houses ahead of me, but I wasn't worried because I could see him just fine. Suddenly, I got this horrible, gut-sinking, freezing cold feeling. I still don't know what tipped me off, but I screamed at him to stop. He slammed on the brakes so hard that his bike tipped, and he scraped his knee, but if he had kept going, he'd be gone. Right in front of him, a big 4WD came flying out of a concealed driveway, huge fence, so we couldn't see it from where we were on the street. It was going so fast that it skidded as it turned into the street, and when it sped off, we could smell burning rubber. My tiny 6-year-old brother wouldn't have had a chance. My parents divorced when I was a teen, and it hit my mom pretty hard, especially with her tough upbringing. So, as frustrated as I get with some of her choices, I understand where she's coming from. I might not like the train wrecks, and I can't save her from herself, but I get it. A few years after the divorce, when I was in my early 20s, she met this guy and fell head over heels. After a short time dating, she brought him over for my sister and me to meet. Immediately, I got a bad vibe from him. He was overly affectionate, pouring on the charm, and trying way too hard to connect with me. He went on about how well his business was doing, all the traveling he did, and the celebs he supposedly knew. The more he talked, the more my bullshit meter went off. Still, Mom was an adult, and as long as she believed him and verified his story, I trusted her. Big mistake. Over time, I noticed he wasn't around for holidays and would go away on business for long periods. When Mom brought up the idea of marriage, I asked her, "Where is this guy from? Where's his family? Why isn't he around?" She didn't have answers. One day, I was watching a show about bigamists with multiple wives in different cities, scamming on taxes and life insurance. I asked Mom a few questions, and bingo, he'd asked her about these exact things. So I talked to my uncle, who works in insurance, and asked if he could get his private investigator to check on the guy. Turns out, the guy had multiple IDs and a full family in Washington, D.C., we're in Texas. I confronted Mom with this info, and she was devastated. I told the guy to get lost. 2 of his exes had died in accidental circumstances, and he'd had life insurance policies on them. Though he wasn't under investigation, I had a strong feeling he was dangerous. I wish I could say that was the last lesson Mom had to learn. But nope, 25 years later, the last guy she lived with was using a fake name, and he got arrested for a warrant on felony burglary. I was the manager at a liquor store and bar combo in Florida, a definite dive bar. One day during happy hour, I get a call on the intercom from the bartender, saying she needs help throwing out 2 women who are causing problems and fighting with each other. So, we tossed them out and banned them for a week. One of them gave me a bad feeling. For the next few weeks, it was rinse and repeat with these 2, until one day, one of them throws a glass ashtray at the female bartender, accusing her of trying to steal her girlfriend. That was it. I tossed them out and banned them for life. A few years later, I saw that same ashtray-throwing woman all over the national news. Turns out she was Aileen Wuornos, who's now a known serial killer. I nearly lost it when I saw that. My hands had touched a serial killer, and I'd thrown her out of a bar multiple times. There was a girl in my high school who always gave me weird vibes, she just seemed off to me. She was nice to me, so I had no real reason to dislike her, but something about her felt strange, especially when she got heated. Her niceness felt very fake. The only time she seemed to show real personality was when she was angry about something: boyfriends, algebra teachers, typical high school drama. I figured I was just being mean or judgmental back then, and eventually, I didn't see her much after freshman year and forgot about her. Well, a year after graduation, I heard that she had delivered a baby at home, ended the baby's life, and buried her in the backyard. The police only found out when the local hospital reported that she checked in with a severe hemorrhage that could only have been caused by childbirth. In her mugshot, she's almost smiling. It's chilling to think about, especially remembering how animated she would get when she was angry. When I was a teenager, I was an introvert and loved reading so much that I would spend hours in my room with a book. One particular night when I was 16, I was on hour 5 or 6 of reading, fully absorbed in my novel, when I suddenly got a terrible feeling that I needed to check on my dad and the family. I felt sick with worry but had no idea why. I couldn't hear anything happening downstairs. My dad had been dealing with pinched nerve pain for the past month and needed a lot of care, so I figured it wouldn't hurt to check on him. I went downstairs to find my mom, sister, and dog all sitting around my dad as he cried from the pain. I begged my mom to call an ambulance, but she and my dad initially refused. Finally, she agreed to take him to the hospital. It turned out that one of his arteries was 100% blocked, and if he hadn't gone into emergency surgery within the hour, he probably wouldn't have made it. They called that artery the Widowmaker. He had actually been having mini heart attacks for weeks, but this one was the most severe. Compared to a lot of these stories, mine's pretty tame, but it fits the question, so here goes. A few years back, I was delivering pizza part-time to pay off some debt. I was like the cool uncle to most of the younger kids working there. One day, a new guy started that everyone thought was pretty cool. I met him, shook his hand, and immediately felt something slimy. Later that night, I told the manager, who was 15 years younger than me, to be careful around him because something felt off. She dismissed it and said to give him a chance. Two things happened that proved me right. First, one night, we were the only two drivers, and I'd worked both my jobs 3 days straight, from 8 a.m. to 1 a.m. I was exhausted, so when the manager said one of us could go, I volunteered. But the new guy begged me to stay, saying he felt sick and was going to throw up. So, I stayed. 10 minutes before closing, he showed up with 2 friends and wanted us to go drinking with them. Second, 2 weeks later, I found out he'd been fired. Turns out he'd been changing the tips on credit card receipts, like changing a 1 to a 4, and so on. He made the mistake of doing it to a regular customer who ordered the same thing and tipped the same amount every Wednesday for 3 years. The customer always checked his transactions online and saw the discrepancy. The company dug up records and found that in 2 months, the guy had managed to steal over $300 that way. When I was about 14, I was waiting to pick up my cousins from their school bus stop in an outer Baltimore neighborhood. I saw a group of teens, maybe 8 boys and 3 girls, walking up the street, yelling at each other and being rowdy. Immediately, I got this gut feeling that I needed to hide. I ran up to the doors of a nearby church, but they were locked, so I ducked behind a bush. They walked by without noticing me. The next day, I took their Doberman, Turbo, with me. We were best friends, and I felt safer with him around, so I sat on the lawn by the bus stop, feeling more at ease. Sure enough, the same group of teens came by again. They noticed me, nudged each other, and walked over. I told Turbo to heel, but he was barking at them. Then, I heard one of them say, "You want to play a game with her?" and another replied, "Nah, you see that dog?" They moved along after that. I have no idea what would have happened to little 14-year-old me if I'd been alone, but that day they went right up the church driveway instead of down the street, so hiding in the bush wouldn't have worked. I'm really glad I had Turbo with me, he's a good boy, and my cousins were thrilled to see him too. With my second baby, I needed a C-section due to some medical issues and having had one with my first. For days leading up to the scheduled date, my anxiety kept building. I tried to talk myself down, telling myself it was just normal stress. I had a toddler, a new baby on the way, worries about money, the usual. But when the day arrived, I was in full-on panic mode. I told my husband that I felt an overwhelming dread, convinced that one of us, either the baby or I, wouldn't make it out of the OR. That morning, I sat down and wrote messages to my family, telling them how much I loved them, and gave them instructions in case I didn't come home. I called my sisters and parents to subtly say my I love yous and goodbyes. I wasn't even finished by the afternoon, almost making us late for the appointment. At the hospital, I was prepped for surgery, and we headed to the OR, but things just kept going wrong. First, the anesthesiologist had trouble placing the epidural. It took half an hour and over 15 jabs with the needle before he finally got it right. When I was finally numb, I got extremely nauseous and disoriented. They were supposed to go get my husband before they started, but they forgot, and I was too out of it to realize they'd already begun. They paused to get him, so there I was, lying open on the table. Once he was there, they continued, and within minutes, my daughter was born. They struggled to get her out because the umbilical cord was wrapped around her neck multiple times. You know, in movies, that intense moment when you wait for the baby to cry. It was exactly like that, except, no cry came. They rushed her to the table, and my husband followed, but she was silent. The respiratory therapist talked through clearing her airway, but still, no cry. After about a minute, I could hear the panic in the voices of the nurses. There was no oxygen on the setup for the baby, and they rushed out of the room. It was just the doctors, the anesthesiologist, and me, left to wonder what was happening. They closed me up, and in recovery, I learned that she did finally breathe, but her lungs were full of fluid. The doctors kept telling me, she'll be here in an hour, then another hour, then 4. Finally, they told me she needed to be life-flighted to the nearest level 5 NICU. I got to see her, covered in tubes in the incubator, for about 2 minutes when they stopped in my room on the way to the helicopter. As soon as I could feel my legs again, I left the hospital against the doctor's wishes to be with her. By a miracle of modern medicine, antibiotics, oxygen, and an incredible hospital team, my little girl made a full recovery. She was very tiny, and it turned out her dating was off. She was born somewhere between 35 and 36 weeks, and her lungs weren't fully ready. I went in feeling like something wasn't right, and if it weren't for the incredible medical advances of today, she wouldn't have survived. I'm so grateful for the care we had access to. Now she's a crazy, sassy, healthy, intelligent, beautiful, stubborn little lady, and I'm thankful for her every day. When I was 10, my family managed and lived in an apartment complex near a busy street in Seattle, Washington. On one side of the building, there was a large yard with a small, 2-story grassy hill and some shrubs separating us from the road. My friends and I always played on this side because it was longer than the other side and perfect for games like football, soccer, or tag. One typical weekend morning, my friends knocked on my door to play. But just as I was heading out, my mom said something ominous along the lines of, "I want you guys to please play on the other side of the building today." Being a young kid, I protested, but her decision was final. I didn't think much of it. A couple of hours later, we heard a sharp screech followed by a crash. We ran to the other side of the building and saw that a young man had swerved off the road, down the hill, and straight into the yard. His car had flipped multiple times, landing exactly where we used to play. The car even destroyed our soccer goals that were under a tree near the edge of the yard. To this day, I have no idea how my mom knew something would happen. I've never brought it up, but she's always had an unusual intuition for dangerous situations. I'm grateful to be alive today. After their youngest child moved out, my mother and father-in-law decided to cope with empty nest syndrome by hosting a foreign exchange student from Germany who was studying at the local college. They grew very close to this girl, often referring to her as our German daughter. She ended up living with them for 2 years before returning to Germany, but she continued visiting, and my father-in-law would see her on his business trips overseas. A few years into this, their youngest was getting married, so we traveled down from several states away. Instead of being picked up by my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, my father-in-law and the German daughter came to get us. Right away, I sensed an intense closeness between them, like an afterglow, and I thought, holy shit, they're definitely involved. I gently brought it up to my husband, but he scoffed, saying I was seeing drama where there was none. During the visit, I kept noticing things that confirmed my suspicion, but I stayed silent because even the thought was clearly upsetting for him. Flash forward about a year later, my father-in-law goes to Germany on business and calls my mother-in-law to confess he's been having an affair with the German daughter since she moved in during college and is thinking about divorce to start a new life in Germany. Somehow, things settled down, and he returned to stay with my mother-in-law until he passed away from cancer about 15 years later. I never fully forgave him for what he put his family through, and for those 15 years after everything came out, I was at best coolly polite to him. My brother's friends used to come around a lot, and one of them would usually bring her current boyfriend. Last summer, when they came over, I immediately felt something wasn't right with this boyfriend. At first, it was small things that made me uneasy, like the way he said certain things or how he'd stare. At some point, we all went out, and I was dressed up a bit more than usual. While we were in the car, I got a message on my Snapchat, and when I opened it, I saw it was from the boyfriend. He made comments about how cute I looked and how I seemed really grown for my age. This set off major alarm bells, but I didn't say anything. Later, after that message, I kept catching him looking at me in a way that felt wrong. It turned out that he was a registered sex offender, on the list for being involved with someone who wasn't of age. He claimed that she hadn't told him how young she was, but the whole experience confirmed my initial feelings about him. My parents befriended a guy from their church who was a couple of years older than me. I was 23 when this happened. I knew of him, but we'd never really met, just small-town connections. One night, they invited him over for dinner, and he brought his pregnant girlfriend. We all ate together, my dad shared his testimony, and then the guy did the same. I'm not religious, so I just sat there waiting for it to end so I could go do something else. His girlfriend was super nice and really attractive, and it seemed strange she was with him because something about him felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I just didn't like him. After dinner, I went to my room, they stayed around chatting, and eventually, they left. A few days later, he showed up again when I happened to be home, but my parents were at work. He said he needed to talk to my dad urgently. I told him to come back later, but he never did. Life went back to normal, and I mostly forgot about him until he showed up again one day. He barely stepped inside before asking my dad for money, claiming he was struggling, his pregnant girlfriend couldn't work, and it was hard to support her. Thankfully, my dad didn't give in and said he'd talk to my mom about it. My mom, of course, refused, helping out financially like that wasn't something our family ever did, especially not for someone we barely knew. After that, he stopped coming around the house. I occasionally heard bits from my parents about him through church until one day, I learned the girlfriend had the baby, and they were doing okay. Then, silence. A few months later, we found out he had physically attacked her and then taken his own life. Fortunately, the baby and his girlfriend were okay. After his death, it came out that he'd scammed many people in the church out of money for various reasons. He was a liar, a thief, and an abuser, and my parents and I had shared a dinner table with him while my parents tried to be friends with him. I knew something felt off that night but just couldn't pinpoint what. Ever since, whenever I get a bad vibe from someone, I trust my gut and keep my distance. Context: I'm a self-employed singing teacher and teach from my home. Recently, I'd been in contact with a guy who was interested in booking a lesson. His text seemed a bit strange, lots of winky emojis and odd comments, but I assumed he'd be more normal in person, so I scheduled a lesson with him. A few weeks later, he texted again, asking if I could do piano lessons at the same time, then criticized me for not teaching from a studio, and insisted that no one else be in the house during the lesson. By that point, I had a bad feeling, so I canceled the booking professionally. He completely flipped out, ranting about how society had failed him, calling me names, and even saying he hoped I got cancer. It went from 0 to 100 in no time and freaked me out a bit. Lesson learned: trust your gut. I'm just glad he never made it into my home for a lesson. My mother, around 9 to 10 years old at the time, was having dinner with her family when someone knocked at the front door. Her dad, my grandfather, got up to answer, and it was a salesman. My grandfather politely declined whatever product he was selling, explaining that they were having family dinner. But the salesman was very pushy, trying to continue talking and even attempting to invite himself inside. At that point, my usually level-headed grandfather got upset and said something along the lines of, "You need to leave now." Finally, the salesman gave up and proceeded to the next house, but not before my grandfather called the neighbors to warn them. The young female neighbor answered the phone and mentioned she was home alone, so my grandfather advised her not to answer the door at all. Fast forward a few months, and it turned out that the salesman was actually a serial abuser, targeting young women who were home alone by posing as a salesman. My grandfather may very well have saved his neighbor's life. This story always reminds me to trust my gut when I get a bad feeling. I gave birth in November to a baby girl who had a very rare neurological disorder. She hardly moved at all in utero, but when I told my doctors, they assured me that every pregnancy and baby is different. I have a healthy son. So, I tried to put my worries to rest. We had a completely normal pregnancy with totally normal tests. No indication of trouble. Then she was born. The second she opened her eyes for the first time, I got a horrible, sinking feeling in my gut. There was nothing there behind her eyes. We were still in the delivery room, and in every picture taken, I look wary, scared. There were immediate issues. She didn't latch, she had no reflexes, and so on. I tried to push down my worries. She was born a few weeks early, and everyone kept saying, bottle feed her, and she'll perk up once she gets closer to her due date. Every nurse, doctor, and lactation consultant reassured us. We were discharged with a healthy baby. But no, a week later, we were back in the NICU because she was still lethargic and not eating. It turned out she was essentially brain dead the entire time. I didn't want to know, but I knew. I knew the moment I looked in her eyes. The diagnosis was Ohtahara syndrome, a catastrophic and fatal epilepsy disorder of infancy. No family history of seizures. A complete surprise, medically speaking. We took her home from the NICU, and she couldn't survive beyond 16 days. My dad had just spent a week in the hospital recovering from quadruple bypass surgery. He was doing really well with rehab and was already up and walking around. So, the hospital decided to send him home a day early. I had been visiting twice a day, and on that last day, one of the nurses remarked that she had been a little worried because he'd been doing so well. That comment set off alarm bells in my head. Working as a psych nurse, I'd often heard similar phrases right before something went wrong. I didn't say anything at the time, but when I got home, I told my wife, who thought I was overreacting. Still, I felt a strong sense of unease and barely slept that night. The next afternoon, my dad was picked up by his partner and her friend, who's also a nurse, for the 2-hour drive home. They stopped for lunch at a place my dad hadn't been in years, honoring a 20-year-old agreement with his best friend. As soon as he sat down for lunch, he collapsed, unable to breathe, sweating profusely. Fortunately, 2 ex-cardiac nurses were nearby, recognized that his chest was filling with blood due to a loose graft from his surgery, and immediately helped keep him stable until an ambulance arrived. He was transferred through another hospital halfway to the main one, just in case he didn't make it, but, thankfully, he did. When he arrived back at the hospital where he'd had his initial surgery, they had an extra graft on hand that was meant to be destroyed the day before, according to protocol. They used it to repair the loose graft in a second surgery, which was a complete success. My dad had weeks of painful recovery afterward, which, ironically, was a reassuring sign he was healing as expected. Not nearly as intense as the rest of these, but here it goes. One night in 7th grade, I was having trouble sleeping. I was up for hours, really freaked out for some reason. I told my mom, and she convinced me to go back to bed. I finally laid down and went to sleep with one of my knives under my pillow, just in case. The next morning, I went upstairs, and my mom was on the computer checking the news. She told me that a guy had broken out of the nearby prison the night before. Apparently, he'd been hiding in the swamp not even 100 feet from our house, and he was originally in prison for homicide and drug trafficking. I was so glad I'd decided to sleep with a knife that night in case he tried to break in through my window, the only unlocked window in the house. My mum and I were walking our dog along our usual route around the local park. On the way back, we started down a narrow road behind a row of houses that's barely wide enough for a single car. Normally, I'd let my dog walk off leash here, but this time, I got a horrible gut feeling and felt an urgent need to leash him. I quickly clipped on his lead and asked my mum to stand against the wall with me because I felt incredibly uneasy. Just seconds later, a car came hurtling through the alley at what must have been a solid 60 miles per hour. I pulled my mum in close and dragged my dog in as tightly as I could. The car missed us by a hair. If it hadn't been for that gut feeling, we would have been hit, and my dog likely wouldn't have survived. We avoid that lane now. One summer, I was out on a canoe with my godparents. I was maybe 9 or 10 at the time. At some point, I looked back around my godfather, who was rowing in the back of the boat, and saw something adrift in the water. Suddenly, I got this strong feeling that it was something important and told them we had to go back and check it out. Both my godparents looked back, saw nothing, and told me to let it go, saying it was probably just driftwood and not worth our time. After a couple of minutes of me panicking and insisting we turn around, they finally caved and turned the canoe around. As we got closer to the floating object, my godmother went, "Godfather's name, you won't believe this," and pulled his wallet out of the water. Turns out it had fallen out of his pocket, and some cash and his ID were floating alongside it. He hadn't even realized he'd brought it with him and still thanks me to this day. About a year ago, I had a nightmare that something bad had happened to my grandpa. Growing up, he was like a dad to me. I stayed with my grandparents a lot. I never usually have nightmares, so I woke up and saw it was 3 a.m. I told my girlfriend about the dream, went back to sleep, but didn't sleep well and woke up early. When I checked my phone, I saw a text from my mom saying that my grandpa was in the hospital with a broken shoulder. Curious, I called my grandma to ask how he was doing and mentioned my dream. I asked if she knew what time he had fallen, and she said he'd gotten out of bed to go to the bathroom, at exactly 3 a.m. This is by far the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. My grandparents live about 500 kilometers away, and I'm by no means a religious person, but this was too strange to just be a coincidence. I still don't know what to make of it. When I was about 3 or 4 years old, I was playing in the yard in a bikini. I remember sticking my belly out really far because I thought it was cool that I could see my belly in my bathing suit. An adult male family member was visiting, and I suddenly felt like someone was watching me. I turned around and noticed he was staring at me. I remember feeling scared, so I sucked my belly in and started looking for my mom. Then he said, "Oh, you have such a cute little tummy." I just remember feeling absolutely panicked in a way I had never felt before. I never told my mom, but as I was growing up, that family member would invite some of us kids over for sleepovers with his adopted son. My mom, however, would never allow me to go. She'd always make up an excuse, saying I needed to get up early for some activity or that I'd been up late and needed rest. I never forgot that panicked feeling and made sure I was never alone with him. If he walked into a room I was in, I'd make an excuse to leave and then go stick to my mom like glue. As you can probably guess, that man was later indicted on federal charges of possession of child exploitation materials, along with other related offenses. My mom and I eventually talked about it, and she told me that while she never had any concrete reason not to trust him, she just felt compelled to trust her gut in this case. That was honestly one of the most important lessons she taught me. Sometimes your gut picks up on things that your conscious mind doesn't, but those instincts are there for a reason. Also, right after I wrecked my car miles away from her, my mom called my cell phone because she had a strong auditory hallucination of me yelling, "MOM. She's a witch." When I was 16, I was dating this guy, and we were very close with his brother and his brother's girlfriend. The brother lived with their mom and stepdad, whereas we lived in our own place. One day, I noticed he looked super skinny and made a joke about him needing to eat more, and he just laughed. No one thought anything of it. A while later, my boyfriend got a call from his mom saying she had booked a last-minute holiday for a week, starting in a couple of weeks. He told me, and for some unknown reason, I yelled, "No, they can't leave his brother alone because he's going to take his life." I had no idea why I said it. It was just a sick feeling in my stomach, and I felt like I had to say it. Obviously, my boyfriend laughed and told me I was being ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling. My gut told me I had to help him. After a few days of bringing it up, my boyfriend finally asked his brother if he was okay, and he said yes, so I started thinking maybe I was just overreacting. Still, I insisted that we stay at his parents' house with his brother that week. So, we did. The first night, the brother was super quiet, sitting there, writing in this big notepad. When we asked what he was writing, he just made a joke about it, but something about it didn't feel right. The next night, my boyfriend asked me to stay home so he could spend time with his brother. I didn't feel good about it but agreed. The next day, I went to work, but all morning, I felt sick, like something was wrong. I just couldn't shake it. When I spoke to my boyfriend after work, he said, I can't find him anywhere. His phone is on the table, but he's nowhere to be found. I started to panic, but he insisted I go home, saying his brother probably just forgot his phone. Still, I knew something wasn't right. But I went home. The next day at work, I was so stressed and couldn't concentrate. I hadn't heard from my boyfriend. Then he showed up on my lunch break, and as we were walking, he said, "You won't need to go back to work today. My stepdad has already spoken to your boss." I was confused, wondering what was going on. We walked to his parents' house, which was about 5 minutes from where I worked, and I noticed his parents' car was there. Strange, I thought. We sat down out front, and he told me he had something to tell me. I knew right away what it was. His brother had taken his own life. The note he was writing on that first night I stayed over was a goodbye note. I was with a friend in her car, and she was speeding through the hills around the back of the mountains where she lives. I was okay with it until we approached a steep hill that dipped sharply, with a bend around and up another steep hill. Suddenly, I had this overwhelming feeling that someone or something was on the road around the corner. I told her, "Slow down. Slow down. There's something around the corner on the road." Just as she eased up and turned the bend, we saw a huge kangaroo standing a foot into our lane. We would have definitely hit it, causing a serious mess to her little car. My friend just stared at me and said, "How the hell did you know that?" I told her, it was just a gut feeling. I was about to leave to work overseas for 2 months, and I had this strong feeling that I shouldn't go, that this was the end of life as I knew it, even though there was no reason to think that. Everyone told me it was just normal nerves about being away for so long, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I sulked and didn't enjoy the first few weeks there because of it. I went through the whole 2 months without any issues, both where I was and back home. As I sat at the gate, waiting for my flight back, I got a text from my sister saying that our mom had leukemia and wasn't expected to survive. She'd had breast cancer 2 years earlier but was in remission, and I'd even spoken to her a week before, and she seemed fine. She was gone by the time I got home. I either had a great gut instinct when it came to avoiding terrible situations, or I had a guardian angel looking out for me when I was younger because I dodged some really bad ones. I made a lot of reckless decisions back then, mostly involving bad company, drugs, and alcohol, but thankfully, I've moved far past that part of my life now. Before I stopped partying, I had some close calls. The biggest incident where my gut saved me was kind of strange, and I still feel there was some psychic sense involved. One of the dumbest, most reckless things my friends and I used to do was drive around town drinking, especially around this lake surrounded by wooded areas. One night, I had a dream that I was in a car with the 2 friends I normally did this with, driving around the lake. We turned a curve, and a deer was standing in the road. The friend driving swerved to avoid the deer, misjudged, and we ended up going down the hill and into a tree. I woke up instantly, heart racing. Usually, I forget my dreams as the day goes on, but this one stuck with me all day, putting me in a weird funk. I mentioned it to my roommate, who was also in the dream and would go on these rides, and we decided not to go out on those rides anymore, realizing just how dangerous they were. Later that evening, our friend who normally drove called and asked if we wanted to go out. We told him we were staying in for the night. He said okay and hung up. We didn't hear from him for about 2 months. We figured he was upset we didn't go out, but we didn't mind because we didn't want to keep going out like that anyway. One day, my roommate got a call from him, and he explained why he hadn't been in touch. Apparently, he went out drinking alone that night even though we didn't join him. He said that while he was driving along our usual route around the lake, a herd of deer appeared out of nowhere. Startled, he swerved, went off the road, and crashed into a tree. He ended up mildly injured, totaled his car, and lost his license, or had it temporarily suspended, I can't remember exactly, because of the drinking and driving. When my roommate told me this, she looked shocked. She told him about my dream, and we were all a bit stunned by the coincidence. After that, I swore I would never get into a car with a drunk driver again and that I'd always listen to my gut and my dreams. This girl who was just friends with my boyfriend at the time gave me a bad feeling from the start. To be fair, I believe that, at first, my boyfriend genuinely saw her as just a friend. But that naivety soon wore off when she openly confessed her feelings to him. She literally messaged, "I like you more than a friend." I know you have a girlfriend, but do you feel the same? He insisted nothing was going on, but she would constantly try to exclude me from conversations, invite him to watch movies, and give me the stink eye whenever he'd ask if I could join. She messaged him constantly, and he'd ignore me to text her. He even forgot about dates we planned and then took her on the same ones, like our little tradition of going to this local coffee shop and sitting in the same seats. Once, I told him I'd meet him there in the afternoon, but when I arrived, he was already there, with her, in our seats. This kept happening, and he'd tell me I was being crazy and controlling for not liking or trusting her. It was infuriating. I genuinely started feeling like I was being dumb and paranoid. Fast forward a few weeks, and he dumped me. Since we shared the same friend group, we tried to keep things civil and hoped to stay friends. That seemed to be working for the first 2 weeks, and in his attempt to be a good guy, he let me know he was now with her. He said they'd been together for a little over a week. He'd waited less than a week after dumping me to start dating her, and still insisted that nothing was going on while we were together, claiming he hadn't developed feelings for her until after we broke up. Right. It was 9 a.m., and I was shopping in the toy section on the basement floor of a Kmart with my 2 kids, my 3-year-old daughter and my infant son, who was in his car seat in the shopping cart I was pushing. We were browsing the princess items when I noticed a man standing at the end cap, watching us. As soon as our eyes met, a wave of unbearable panic washed over me, and somehow, I knew this man was dangerous. I swear his lip curled into a sneer, and he made a small smile at me before glancing down at my daughter and walking straight toward us. Fight or flight kicked in. I picked up my daughter, threw her in the cart, and ran. In full panic mode, I couldn't remember where the elevator was, but then I spotted another mom and ran over to her. I quickly told her about the man, and we both decided to leave together and find management. We walked to the elevator and went up. As soon as the doors opened, we saw the store manager giving an orientation tour to a group. We explained what had happened, and they said they'd go look for the guy. I didn't stick around. I grabbed my kids, left the cart, and headed straight for the exit. As I was walking to my car, I saw a cop and told him about the man. The cop said he'd check it out, but just as he walked into the entrance, the creepy man walked out. The cop didn't even see him. I stood there, watching the man go from a brisk walk to a full sprint, running across the parking lot until he was out of sight. I don't know how or why it happened, but I fully believe that man was pure evil and had intentions of harming my children. Always go with your gut. Always. Many years ago, I was assigned to train a new lady to be the store manager. Right from our first meeting, I had a bad feeling and felt like this would be a big mistake. I even told my supervisor about my concerns, but nothing came of it. Within 2 months, this new manager was stealing both merchandise and money. She'd take multi-hour lunch breaks, sit in the back and avoid helping anyone, and had her family come in, pretending to shop, only for her to let them take things for free. If any employee spoke up about her unethical behavior, she'd make up lies and fire them. Corporate began noticing because profits were dropping, merchandise was missing, and employees were either being fired or leaving in droves. They launched an investigation, but by then it was too late. The new manager's actions ultimately cost the business. It was a small store, and it couldn't recover. I lived in a trailer park surrounded by hedges, with a small gate in the hedges that residents used to get in and out. This gate was very close to my trailer. One day, when I was around 12 or 13, I was sitting under a tree on the exterior side of the gate, waiting for my mom to get home since I'd forgotten my trailer key. It was a nice day, so I tried to make the best of it. After a while, I noticed 2 older teens or young adults about 50 yards away on the sidewalk, heading in my direction. They seemed to be looking at me, but nothing obviously threatening. Still, after a few seconds of watching them, I got this feeling I should head back into the trailer park. As I walked through the gate, I heard one of them yell, "Kid, stop." I bolted through the gate, but without my trailer key, I didn't have much protection. I quickly hopped into the back of a neighbor's pickup truck and lay down as still as possible. Moments later, I heard the 2 of them crashing through the gate. They mumbled to each other, wondering where I'd gone, but it sounded like they gave up quickly and left. I stayed hidden for about 20 minutes until I heard the sound of my mom's car approaching. It had a distinct sound because of the messed up motor mounts. Not as intense as other stories, but I've always wondered what those 2 wanted with a kid like me. When I was 20, I worked as a bartender in a restaurant located on the same lot as a nightclub. One Saturday night, the club was so busy that it was impossible to catch a cab. Every time one pulled up, someone else would grab it. A police officer suggested I walk down the road to a nearby hotel to catch a cab there since the buses had stopped running. As I walked down the road, I noticed a couple of guys following me, and I had a strong feeling they were up to no good. The hotel was less than a block away, so I made sure to walk quickly and went straight to the front desk when I got there. The front desk clerk basically got to witness a young girl walk in with two sketchy-looking guys close behind her. As soon as they saw the clerk, they turned around and left. He made it his mission to get me a cab right away. I was at a party once in an apartment complex known for its sketchy tenants. I only knew a few people there, so I just stuck close to one of my friends. Halfway through the party, a girl I'd met a few months back at a job, I'll call her Sally, showed up with two guys who seemed really shady. They were pushing drugs, feeding Sally tons of whiskey, and no one really knew who invited them. By 11 p.m., Sally was completely messed up. My friend and I left to get more beer and came back an hour later. Sally was in rough shape, lying on the floor in the back room. Her friends who brought her refused to let me take her to the bathroom to help her throw up. Chaos ensued, so I left. On my way back to my friend's apartment, I called 911 because I knew something was seriously wrong with her. EMTs showed up and took her to the hospital. 2 days later, she messaged me on Facebook to tell me the doctors found multiple drugs in her system that she didn't willingly take. She suspected her friends, but wasn't sure. I'm positive it was them. 6 months later, a news article was posted. One of those sketchy guys had been arrested for running a trafficking business out of a nearby hotel. Basically, the moment I saw those guys show up with Sally, I knew something was fishy. And I was right, they were dangerous people.